Hello, everyone. It is a blessing that you have joined with us today. For those of you who may not know who I am, say a friend shared this link with you. Well, I'm Lieutenant Joshua Kane, who along with my wife Cassie, we serve as the Corps officers at the Salvation Army's High Point Community Church. I pray that this time of worship would be meaningful for you as we continue to mark this season of Advent together. And on that note, I just want to, for a moment, acknowledge that for most of us, Christmas is going to look a little different this year. What with the recent health orders and not being able to gather. And if you're like me, then this only compounds on the disappointment of unmet expectations for this year. But Advent is a season of waiting. And I don't know how Christmas was done in your home growing up, but for me, when I think of waiting, I always think of Christmas presents underneath the tree. My parents, they would always place the gifts out way in advance of Christmas morning. And so as a child, I would look at all these gifts underneath the tree and I'd try to guess what each one was. Maybe even shake it a little bit if nobody was looking. And then I'd have to wait in that agonizing anticipation of a child for it to finally be Christmas morning when I can open up my gifts. So for me, that represents Advent, that expectant waiting of what we know is to come. But it might be harder this year to get into that mindset. If it feels like everything that we're expectantly waiting for is canceled. But that is exactly why we need a little Christmas, even before the 25th, and celebrate now and experience what it brings to us in this season. Hope, peace, and this week, joy. Joy is one of those tricky topics in our world today, as the word carries different meanings for different people. Even in the Bible, we can see this word applied to different situations. But at the root of it all, a biblical understanding of joy is that it is not determined by our struggles, but rather by our future hope in Christ. Let me say that again just now. A biblical understanding of joy is that it is not determined by our struggles, but rather by our future destiny found in God. And as we dive into our text for today, I hope that this definition of joy resonates with all of you. That despite where we find ourselves today in this season, that we can see that there is joy to be found at Christmas. So at this time, if you have a Bible handy, I invite you to go and to grab that now and open it up with me to the book of Matthew. And we're going to be looking at Matthew 2, verses 1 to 12 today. That's Matthew 2, verses 1 through 12. And I'll give you just a moment just to find that and pull it up with me so that we can read along together. That's Matthew 2, beginning in verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born, King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them, until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. May the Lord bless this reading of his word this day. Now, right before you clicked into the sermon, we sang together the classic Christmas carol, We Three Kings. Now, I gotta say that as a kid, this was my favorite Christmas carol. Perhaps, partly due to the fact that you can make up your own silly words to it. But I always had an affinity for this song growing up. For example, I can remember being a wise man in a Christmas pageant and singing the song at a Christmas concert as a kid. But these three kings, they were my favorite part of the Christmas story. But however, as we can see from our reading of the text just now, they didn't show up that silent night. These events took place after Jesus had already been born. And they've kind of been inserted into the Christmas story. But nonetheless, this episode is extremely important in the early life of Jesus because it has a lot to say about the expectations surrounding the birth of Christ. All of the characters that we're going to look at today had different expectations surrounding Jesus' birth. Let's start with our wise men. Now, the Bible tells us that they were wise men from the east. Now, we can unpack this a little bit. For you see, in those days, astrologers were considered to be wise men. Men who could read the stars to interpret signs and interpret the times through them. And they were often advisors to kings. And from the east, well, that would mean that they were either from Persia or from Babylon. Now, what we have here is that on one particular night, as they were observing the heavens, they saw a new star rise. And from that, they interpreted it to mean that the King of the Jews had been born. Now, how they came to this conclusion, the Bible, it doesn't really say. Some have tried to argue or give, some sort of scientific explanation for this solar phenomenon that must have happened. But at the end of the day, that doesn't really matter here. What matters is that this particular group of wise men interpreted this star to mean that the King of the Jews had been born, and that they were so convinced by this assessment that they traveled from their homeland in search of this king. And where would you expect to find a king? Well, naturally, you would expect him to find him in the capital, in the palace. Only the thing is that he wasn't there. At the wise men's arrival to Jerusalem, instead of finding the king that they were looking for, they found a different sort of king. You see, Herod also had expectations regarding the birth of Jesus. For you see, Herod, he was only a king in name. The Jewish people had not had a true king in centuries. As Cassie mentioned last week in her sermon, the line of David had been broken centuries prior to this. Therefore, there had not been a true claim to the throne since then. But now we got these foreigners that enter into Jerusalem asking where the king had been born. And Herod and his entourage, they know what this means. That the Messiah, that God's anointed one had been born. And their reaction to this is telling. The Bible tells us in verse 3 that they were troubled by this news. That they responded to this news with fear. For if this child is king, then Herod is not. And for Herod, this was an ancient prophecy about a future hope that was finally being fulfilled here and now, and Herod very much wished for it to stay in the future. For Herod certainly wasn't expecting God to fulfill his promise now, and he was prepared to do anything to stop it. So what we have are wise men on a journey looking for a king who wasn't at their destination, and a king who was troubled by the news that they bring. Now, both of these characters that we see here, they have unmet expectations about this night. The wise men have journeyed all this way on the basis of their interpretation only to arrive at the wrong location. We have to imagine, the cost and the time and the energy that went into a journey like this, only for the king that they're looking for not to be there. And then we have Herod, who's none too happy about this news and who wants to put a stop to this newborn threat to his power. Both of them have expectations. The wise men finding this new king, and Herod, staying king. And both don't seem to be going well for them. If we're honest, I think many of us fall into this camp too this year. The holidays are a time of the year when we have certain expectations about what's supposed to happen. If you're anything like me, then you tend to be a bit of a creature of habit. When Christmas rolls around, there are certain things we like to do, places to go, people to see, things to bake, movies to watch. And this year it seemed like that's just all been disrupted. This year has been a journey. It feels like it's both dragged on and flown by. You know what, with all the events and all the watershed moments that happened this year has felt like running both a marathon and a sprint at the same time. We've been through a lot. Collectively, we've been through a lot. And now that we've reached the end of this year, it may feel like we're the wise men who have arrived at the wrong destination. The thing that we've been searching for, the thing that Christmas invokes in us, those old familiar comforts and routines, those things that we enjoy this time of year, that raise our spirits and warm our hearts, they seem to be noticeably absent. They aren't where we expected them to be. We have come all this way through 2020, made this journey throughout this year, and December hasn't been what we've expected it to be. We feel tired, worn out from this year of restrictions, and perhaps we're wondering if this journey has been worth it. We've made it to Christmas, but so what? We may feel as though Christmas is just another casualty of 2020. Another canceled expectation with all the joy sucked out of it. And ultimately, disappointment sucks. I think it's fair to say that these wise men may have been feeling much the same way. After traveling thousands of miles through a desert in search of a newborn king. But my friends, our story doesn't end on a note of disappointment. The good news is that disappointment doesn't win the day, but rather joy does. As I shared with you earlier, our biblical definition of joy means that it's not defined by our struggles or our situations, but rather it is defined by our future hope in God. And what we have presented to us today in this text is that future hope is bursting into our present right here before us now in a brand new, unexpected way. For you see, while these wise men may have left Jerusalem feeling discouraged and let down, they didn't stay that way for long. Because as they made their way towards Jerusalem, that very same star that they had spotted from their home country appeared right before them that night. The very star that started their journey was now signaling its end. The text tells us in verse 10 that when they saw that star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. All that disappointment was washed away and was replaced with joy. Why? Because this star meant that they had in fact found what they were looking for. That this journey that they had been on was coming to an end, and that this journey had not been for nothing. But what had they found? Let's just unpack that together for a moment. What had they found? They hadn't discovered some new country or made some brand new scientific breakthrough or anything like that. What they had found was some small, unassuming Jewish child who they understood to be the King of the Jews, who Herod understood to be the long-awaited Christ, Israel's Messiah, and who we know today to be God's own Son, our God Emmanuel. It is in the child of Jesus that we find the fulfillment of God's promises. He had said to his people that he would send a deliverer to them, that he would send an heir to the throne of David. And here in this child is that promise kept. And what we see is that these wise men worship him, that they offer him reverence, that they offer him treasures fit for a king. Only this child, he would grow up to be a different sort of king, that he would usher in a radically new kind of kingdom, that this child would be greater than these wise men could ever imagine. This child, he would be the one to inaugurate God's kingdom of heaven here on earth, defeat the powers of sin and darkness, and would be the one through which God's goodness would enter into our world in a brand new way. Because this small child here is God incarnate, God taken on human flesh. He is our God Emmanuel, which means our God who is with us. And he is with us today. We see in Jesus our future hope in God that was born to us at Christmas. So my friends, in this season, we can rejoice that that source of hope, that the source of our hope was born. That God has kept his word. And that he came down to earth to be in the thick of it all with us as one who is like us. So my friends, let this be what we find our joy in this Christmas season. The meaning of that star 2,000 years ago has not lost its meaning to us today. 2020 has not robbed it of its ability to bring us joy, to stir up our hearts within us. When we look upon a Christmas star, whether it's one on a tree at home or one that we see elsewhere, and reflect upon its meaning, it reminds us, just like the wise men, that our journey this year has not been made in vain. That this season is still one with the ability to fill our hearts with joy. Because the birth of our Savior is a joyous celebration. Because it demonstrates to us undeniably that our God has kept his word. That he has fulfilled his promises to his people and to us. And that he would send a rescuer. This expectation doesn't remain unmet. But he didn't merely send anyone to do this job, but rather he sent himself. He sent his Son to be Emmanuel, to be a God who was with us in the thick of it all, and a God that we can find. He has come to our world in order to be found. And like the wise men, there is joy in the finding. There is joy because at the end of a very, very long year, we are reminded that Christ entered our world. And it is different now because of him. A birth is always a cause for a celebration. And this little child is one who has come to bring us hope, peace, and joy into our world today. So just as we come to a close today, I'd like for us to listen and sing along to one of my favorite Christmas carols. It's the carol, "What Child Is This?" And as I reflect on it, this song fits our text very well today. As we saw, there were many expectations around Jesus' birth. To the wise men, he was the newly born King of the Jews. To Herod and his entourage in Jerusalem, he was a usurper and a threat. To Mary and Joseph, he was their child. But as this song tells us, this child, this is Christ the King, the Word of God made flesh. We have joy because God has entered into our world. We have joy because we can know him today. And we have joy because even in a year such as 2020, our hope in him remains unshaken. Yes, our celebrations may look different this year, but our God remains constant for us. So let us today root our faith and our hope in the life of Jesus and his love for us. And as the final verse of our next song goes, raise, raise a song on high. The Virgin sings her lullaby. Joy, joy, for Christ is born, the babe, the Son of Mary. Let us discover a little joy today. May the Lord bless you and keep you always, my friends. God bless.